Okay, so good morning. I first off want to thank PABC for allowing me to come here and speak to you today about this specific subject. As well, I'd like to tell you how appreciative I am that you've all shown up for the eye-opener session. I hope within the next 15 minutes that your eyes still will be open. So what I wanted to do is start to just give a brief rundown of how I got here today. Fascia is something that I started to look into after completing my education at UBC some 20-odd years ago. And after going into the CAMPT system where I had a fantastic education, as Canadians are very fortunate to have this, I've learned, since meeting other international physios. Then I decided that I wanted to try to treat my patients more effectively, and looking at the different aspects that are controlling a joint, I began IMS. And that gave me some improvement in patients, but it was limited by my patient population. Certain people I couldn't needle. And so at that point, I started, while needling, realizing I was going through fascial layers. And I really started to think about what's going on with the fascia. I don't really know anything about fascia, and we've never really had that as much of an education, whether I think about in university or afterward. So I started looking far and wide, and I could not find very much information on fascia. So it did take me to Italy. Places that I've been in North America, I found that the techniques weren't evidence-based enough for what I thought was important for my learning. So in Italy, I met the family Stecco, Luigi Stecco, a physiotherapist who's been studying for 40 years fascia. His daughter, Carla Stecco, who is an orthopedic surgeon, who is the foremost expert on fascial anatomy. Her brother, Antonio Stecco, is a physiatrist who's currently studying the fascia, the role of fascia and hyaluronic acid on myofascial pain. Thank you. So we get to the fascia, the Cinderella tissue. I'm sorry, I'm going to try to stay over the mic. I'm used to wandering around, so I apologize if I get out of control. So basically, Cinderella tissue, because, as Kevin alluded to, it really hasn't been given much information. So I'm starting off from a story perspective. Here we have a Rembrandt painting of an anatomist. Once upon a time, and as I said, very little information is given. When I was in school, you would go to do a dissection if you were lucky enough to do it, and you would just rip the fascia off. Nobody would ever talk about it. So the research that's been done, currently 1 million articles if you do a PubMed search on muscle. Whereas looking at fascia, it's about 20,000. And about 5 years ago, 100 articles on fascia. So fascia historically has been described as disorganized in structure, a tissue of containment, ligamentous and aponeurotic tissue. And what do we know about fascia? So it's the soft tissue component of the connective tissue system. It has cells for metabolism. It has fiber for structure, and also known as ground substance. And this is the ground substance: fibroblasts, collagen fibers, elastic fibers, nerve fibers. And this is looking at electron microscopy image of it, and you can see those similar structures within that. So this is looking at an ultrasound image of a cross-section. The deep fascia. And in between, there's a fine line that's a superficial fascia. And that separates the superficial adipose tissue, deep adipose tissue. And in this way helps to separate the movement of the fascia and the muscle below from the cutis layer above. And of course, we have the muscle and its endofascial tissue below. This is looking at one of Carla Stecco's dissections of the This is looking at the superficial fascia of the abdomen. And here you as the external oblique and internal oblique deep fascia. So now we're going to talk about the deep fascia of the anterior thigh, and we're going to go through a dissection as Carla Stecco would. Basically, she would come in and remove the cutis layer, looking and analyzing the subcutaneous adipose tissue. Three separate definite layers. They are oriented at 78 degrees in difference at each of those layers. So perhaps one would be longitudinal in direction, another horizontal, and another more oblique to allow gliding and multi-directional movement in the limb. The collagen fraction is about 18% and 1% in the crural fascia. This is looking at the antebrachial fascia, and we can see different fibers, or actually a multi-layered organization. And also the loose allows gliding. Deep fascia of the trunk is different than the deep fascia of the limbs because it's not multi-layered. Instead, it is a bilaminar type of fascia. So over the superficial muscles of the trunk, it will actually split and cover those muscles. The difference is it's way more intimate because of on the inner surface of the deep fascia, there are septa that attach down into the muscle fibers so that when the muscle contracts, it will tension the fascia and sending force. So we then have the relationship of the muscle and the fascia, and we have the endomysium, which you can see in the upper left-hand corner in that felt work kind of tissue. It's honeycomb-like. It's almost like exoskeleton if you can look throughout the whole fascia. Paramecium is the fascia around the fascicles, and epimecium is that which envelops the whole muscle. Here we have a depiction of looking at the crossing of the fibers in the cubital fossa. It's very easy to see by the naked eye. As well, you can see over the xiphoid process and over the thoracolumbar and lumbosacral junction. So the retinaculum is a derivative of the deep fascia, which often has been called ligament. So this is from Gray's Anatomy, looking at the laciniate ligament, which is to attach the medial malleolus to the calcaneus. He then goes on to say how this ligament is actually continuous with the deep fascia of the crura, as well as it's continuous down with the plantar fascia and below. So perhaps not a ligament, perhaps it is part of the fascial system. And why does fascia attach to bone? Force transmission, can it transmit force? So a study was done, Carla Stecco was looking basically at the upper limb, looking at the trunk deep fascia, the pec major, and the latissimus dorsi, had about roughly 4 kilograms of force before their tendinous expansions would rupture. Looking at the limb fascia, it would take 6 to 7 kilograms for the myotendinous junctions to rupture. It also has a sliding system. So different authors have found that there is a areolar tissue layer between the different fascial layers that allows movement. And it seems to be lined with lubricant, hyaluronic acid. And it's been considered one of the chief components of the extracellular matrix within the deep fascia. What is hyaluronic acid? It's a hydrating, space-filling polymer, and basically is within the endomuscular fascia as well as within the deep fascia. It's especially concentrated between the epimysium and the deepest layer of fascia, where it's actually synthesized by fibroblastic-like cells, which have been termed fasciocytes. So other connections, myofascial expansions. Here you can see from the pectoralis fascia attaching to the brachial fascia, both on the anterior and the medial aspect. We also have muscle fiber attachments. This is the proximal aspect of the flexor carpi ulnaris, and you can see that these muscles take origin from the inner layer of the deep fascia, and they're reinforced in their attachments. And then we have aponeurotic expansions, here from the bicipital aponeurosis onto the antebrachial fascia, again, both anterior, in this case, medial. So why are there attachments? We have attachments of muscle fiber onto deep fascia. We thought muscle attaches to bone, creates movement at a joint, where in fact 35% of muscle fibers have no attachment whatsoever to bone. So what is their function? Perhaps fascia plays a role in the locomotor system. If it's innervated, it certainly can. So Carlos Stecco looked at this in 2007 and found that the innervation, or the receptors, were free nerve endings, Pacini corpuscles, and Ruffini corpuscles, especially in concentration around the retinacular area. Others have found this as well. So if we look at some of her histological slides, you can see the brown staining is the nerve, the blue staining is fibroblasts, so you can see in the free nerve endings that it's actually quite intimate with the tissue. As with the Ruffini corpuscles, you can see that there is the nerve wrapped around the loose connective tissue, the fascia, and the loose connective tissue around that, similar with Golgi-Mazzoni corpuscles. So possibly could nerve termination within the fascia perceive the state of contraction of these underlying muscles and be a source of a change in proprioception as well as in pain. So also we have the muscle spindle, another very important receptor, and this is within the paramecium, so around the fascicle. And you can see it's lying in parallel with the muscle fibers. The interfusal muscle fiber is enveloped by the brown staining annulospiral endings. And so very intimate. If there's any problem within that area, it definitely can restrict your ability to recruit and use your muscle spindle. So you can actually give all those recruitment exercises you want, but if you don't affect what's affecting the spindle, you're not going to get a good effect. And here I have ultrasound of the fascial sliding system. This is of a quadricep muscle, and you can see at the top layer of the screen is the cutis, the superficial fascia, and then there are three layers of the fascia gliding. I'm going to try to do that again. Oh, it's not going to let me do it again. No, this is now the pathological sliding system, whereas in the other we are getting gliding of those three layers. So I'm sorry, I don't have a pointer to use, but you can see now it's more at an incline of the fascia, and now when it goes to contract, it's the same person, their contralateral limb, looking at a quadricep isometric contraction, and you can see it's not gliding, and instead it's rocking. So it's actually, this is a good image of the pathological sliding system. So I'll wrap up by talking about fascial characteristics, talked about intramuscular and extramuscular components, including surrounding neurovascular and internal systems. It's a multi-layered 3D structure, or an intimate epimysial structure. It plays a role in force transmission in certain areas, in series and in parallel. It works as a sliding system, as well it plays a role as in proprioception. So there's coordination, force, recruitment, and continuity throughout. And so perhaps considering the active role of fascia in the biomechanical system is not too far-fetched. Fiona. Thank you. Nope, I'm not done. She's just fixing a slide. And so I just wanted to wrap up. So we talked about how fascia was looked at in dissection. This is Carlos Stecco in Padova doing a dissection. And she's basically with her class in Padova looking at a cadaver that is a fresh dissection. Okay, Fiona? Thank you. So we have fascia the Cinderella tissue. It's now being seen in a new light. It's now being looked at differently. I myself look at people differently now when they walk in. I will assess people differently. I treat people differently, and I actually get a really good result. I get a different result. So, after all, in homage to Rebecca Tunnicliffe, Cinderella is proof that a new pair of shoes can change your life, and I thank you for being here today. And I'd also like to thank the family Stecco from Italy, because if it wasn't for me going to Italy and learning from them, I would not be here speaking with you today. Thank you very much.